So how do we have such contrasting stories of what I've just presented, contrasted with the opening? Well, other than Israel and Palestine, I would say there's probably no more concerted campaign of distortion and propaganda. It's just phenomenal how you cannot get objective news reporting, certainly not from US corporate media. I really have to dig for independent coverage to find out more than this the party line that we're given. Let's take an example here of media spin. So, terrible hurricane that occurred a few years ago in Cuba. Power was knocked out completely in many areas. Keep in mind that Cuba is recognized by the UN as being the most prepared place in the entire region, one of the most prepared places in the world for dealing with such disasters. This is an article I wrote on Substack on the right about how they have actually did this incredible evacuation of 7% of their population. This you'll never hear mentioned in the mainstream media. And so when they talked about the hurricane, then that was not a preface. Contrast that type of preparedness and commitment and response to their people. Contrast that with our experience with Katrina, where what estimated 2,000 people died, not necessarily from the initial floodwaters, but from the neglect, the negligence that occurred from government and from vigilantes and police shootings, just completely unnecessary. Or Hurricane Maria 10 years ago in Puerto Rico, where for months people were without power, and even up till last year, the energy grid was only operating at like 2/3 of its capacity, and people were protesting for months. So coming back to Cuba, what happened? Well, notice on the left, even NBC is noticing protests in Cuba erupt after not months or weeks, after days without power. So in other words, even though Cuba's had problems with power for quite some time, on and off, people generally had pretty reliable power. And they certainly had reliable government. So to go for days without power and for days without anyone from the government coming and talking to you and saying what's going on, they're not used to that. And so people got very upset. I talked to journalists about this, and this is they were saying was really the impetus. It was the lack of electricity for days and the lack of any sort of communication. People got upset and there were protests, and those were seen by certain elements as an opportunity to make the signs, but not just we need power, we need government, but to make it against the system. And so there were elements that were really fomenting a higher degree of sort of dissent than many of the other people. And so you see the reaction by police to some of the protests here, but do look closely at what the police here are and are not wearing. We'll come back to this in a minute. When power was restored, after not too much time, the riots dissipated. Well, I do need to add, after power was restored and hundreds of people were arrested, that this is true, because the government did take that very seriously and cracked down very strongly on those most strident elements. So let's talk about that. This is another area to really look at very closely, because this is one of the most severe critiques that is levied at Cuba. Lack of free speech, lack of intolerance of dissent, and high incarceration rates. Well, I don't think these should be made light of. And I appreciate the fact that Noam Chomsky raised this with Raul Castro, and leftists definitely need to give this attention. But we also have to understand it in the context of Cuba, which has been under siege from its very inception, from the revolution, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But also view it in the context of comparing to other societies. So here we have incarceration rates, and it's just curious how some other countries that are not under siege, that are not constantly threatened like Cuba has been, have considerably higher or very comparable incarceration rates. So the US has 1/4 higher at that time. Prison population rates can really vary, but just a few years ago, that Cuba was at 3/4 of the US, and the Maldives, what was happening in the Maldives, that they have a prison rate that's comparable to Cuba, right? Cuba, again, under attack. So needs to be really looked at. We always hope for greater human rights, but assessing these things without looking at the context without comparisons, and also the context of a country is really not fair. Also, we need to consider the expansive view of human rights taken by Cuba, and uniquely Cuba, where for them human rights include economic rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, whereas in so many other countries, in most other countries, at least one of these, if not all three, would be grounds for harassment, imprisonment, torture, and possibly even death. Laborers speaking up, women actually undergoing abortions illegally, and certainly for gay and trans folks in so many countries around the world. So when remembered that those are human rights as well, it also changes the picture, colors the picture, certainly, in terms of human rights in Cuba. And again, in terms of comparisons, let's look at what governmental response looks like globally in terms of how governments respond to protest. I mean, this is the typical scene we see around the world. The US, Latin America, the Caribbean, certainly in the Middle East, and not just in response to protests, but governments that are initiating repression that we see around the world and that we know all too well right here at home. So why is it then that Cuba is so singled out and vilified? Well, many of us know the particular constituencies in Florida, also now strongly in New Jersey, that had left at the time of the revolution, and they view this as their country that they want to take back. And how is it their country? Cuba, after the Spanish-American War in the turn of the century, came under something called the Platt Amendment, which allowed the U.S., both the government and corporations, to completely dominate Cuba. Its military, its economy, its police apparatus were run almost entirely by the U.S., or certainly puppets of the U.S. And major investments, of course, in industry, particularly sugar and tobacco, and sugar, of course, critical for rum making. And so this was a land run by the rich and powerful industry, and it was the glamorous life. Again, 90 miles from Florida. That's Lucky Luciano there. The mafia made it their headquarters for some years in the 50s. And so this was a land where they could do anything they wanted. Didn't have to worry about really labor rights and practices, didn't have to worry about abiding by human rights. So segregation was the norm, racial segregation, and political repression was intense. Just imagine what it was like in terms of not only labor abuse, but then sexual abuse. If we think that even in this country, with all of our rights and our police apparatus and our surveillance, that an Epstein Island could take place and get away with it still, imagine what Cuba was like, particularly for Black and brown folks, subject to the whims of wealthy white folks coming in and doing their bidding. So I think of not just Little Paris, but I think of particularly Havana, but Cuba overall, as probably having been Big Epstein. And all this was then turned over by the revolution. So imagine, almost overnight, obviously it was years in the making, but January 1st, 1959, the revolutionary forces were able to enter Havana, take over. Batista escapes, unfortunately, and it becomes night and day. I mean, it becomes a symbol of resistance to all these terrible things. Obviously, it has its own internal challenges in terms of human rights and freedoms and establishing a government, but it becomes this symbol for the world and committed to people over profit, but against great odds. So because the revolution insisted on not compromising on certain key things, but ensuring that Cuba became an island for Cubans, so nationalization being the key element, the US turned its back. Kennedy said no, rejected that, saw them as a threat, refused to buy Cuban sugar. Now understand that sugar was Cuba's number one export, and the United States was their number one importer. So this was tremendous. So Cuba turned to elsewhere for support and found it in the Soviet Union, which of course was just the death knell for them in terms of how Kennedy and then Eisenhower viewed things. And so from that point, we have the embargo. So this is within a year after the revolution. We have the embargo established in its first iteration. It was intensified over the years. The Bay of Pigs invasion, only 2 years after the revolution was established, where the U.S. thinking that obviously Cubans don't really want this revolutionary government, that they will side with the U.S. forces coming in. Didn't happen at all, and the U.S. got its ass kicked, as we know. But bombings of airlines and department stores that killed many people, the CIA actually had this terrorist program, Operation Mongoose, to destabilize the government. And Miami was known as the terrorist capital of the U.S. We have extensive documentation of numerous assassination attempts against Castro. It's amazing that none of them succeeded. And the embargo has been opposed every year by the UN. They vote against the embargo. I say they in the General Assembly, which of course has no real power because they can't get the Security Council to do this, because the US and Israel are the two dissenting votes consistently, and possibly along with some other lackey nations, and then there's some abstentions. But most of the world's powers do vote in favor of stopping and condemning this horrible blockade, which has cost the country so much now for 67 years. And worse than that, or on top of that, Trump in his first term added Cuba, a country which has been a victim of terrorism, of course, as we just heard, and has never done, there's no evidence of any terrorism anywhere in the world against anyone, but Trump throws them on the terrorism list, which means that even for all the countries around the world that are in solidarity with Cuba, they're bound by the SST for any group that's on there, that they block financial transactions. So Cuba has been stymied not only by an economic blockade, more than just a U.S. embargo, but an economic blockade because the U.S. imposes around trade, but then in terms of even financial transactions. So this has cost them in a major way, and they constantly look to ways of around it. But it's a major thing which Biden allowed to remain until his very last day in office. He took them off on the last day, and of course, Trump then reinstituted it. The reason why there isn't the type of outcry that there should be for a country with such amazing results, undergoing such incredible repression and imperialist aggression, is because of, again, the enduring propaganda, the smear campaign that's so intense against Cuba, and including even with, how can you belittle the incredible impact of the Doctors Abroad program that the world is saying, yeah, is wonderful. Well, they've come up with this mythology about, well, it's forced labor. The doctors don't really want to do it, but they're forced. And then there's the story of Elian, baby Elian, who became this poster child for the right. The right here, which, espouses family values, and yet in the, when this happened in the early 90s, I guess, baby Elian was found floating, having survived when his mom had actually taken him without the dad's approval to try to attempt the horrible straight crossing to get to Florida. And she drowned, he survived. And so some extended family and these Cuban anti-Castro folks in Miami refused to let him go back to his father, who loved him and wanted him brought back to Cuba. So forget family values. No, they denied that. And Clinton and Janet Reno actually had to come in by force to get the child from these folks and send him back. Well, you heard a lot about baby Elian because they made that cause célèbre, but you don't hear anything about adult Elian. Elian went to college, got an engineering degree, and became a proud member of the National Assembly in Cuba, at least as of a few years ago. So that's, again, part of the myth-making, the stories that they tell you and the parts that they don't want to include. The other big mythology that's going around is the notion of a failed state. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, the very fundamental notion of Cuba not being safe. So, here to elaborate again on what I said before, showing the map, notice that none of these arrows emanate from Cuba. they're going around Cuba, but none of the drug trafficking is from Cuba, nor is are any of the major reasons that are driving the regional problems and the migration from Central America applying to Cuba, right? The drug running, the weapons proliferation, extreme violence, the gang rule, none of this is Cuba. And yet Cuba is the one that's vilified. So let's quickly talk about the failed state. So again, setting aside ideology or partisanship, there are some key indicators that everyone uses to indicate, quality of life and sort of whether a society is developed and successful or not. And three of those key indicators are infant mortality, life expectancy, and literacy. Those are just very basic. Well, when we look at these numbers, we see that Cuba outperforms the US and comparably sized, comparably located Dominican Republic by far. So almost one third, nearly one third of the infant mortality, and 1/8 of the infant mortality. I'm sorry, one third in the U.S. and 1/8 of the rate in the Dominican Republic. It exceeds life expectancy by 5 years, which is quite significant compared to the U.S. And almost that amount in Dominican Republic. And in literacy, it's 3 times the level in the US practically, and nearly 5 times the level of Dominican Republic. So, and again, I'm sorry, but the numbers of the US, as you see, I chose specifically with around African Americans, except for the last, which is overall US. 35% measured at elementary is what the literacy level is really in the US. So these outstanding performance of Cuba in these key quality of life indicators. And you could, of course, add many other quality of life measures, the home ownership I talked about before, which, by the way, if you then take into account in the US, the number of folks who have actual equity, right, free of any debt, it goes from that 65% down to 40%. I talked about access to a doctor, the disaster management, and if you factor in debt from college, of course, Cuba or graduate school, zero, whereas in the United States, it's just astounding. But while many of these social measures are often recognized by some people about Cuba, they will say, even many liberals will say, yes, but the economic model, the economics doesn't work. Well, let's look at that, because even I had come to sort of accept that, given that it's just repeated over and over again, just like weapons of mass destruction. But let's actually look at the evidence. So here, sorry, the chart looks a little confusing, but basically I wanted to show the real chart, and then I just highlighted. So Costa Rica, during the years of 06 to 08, right, that's the blue, the first number, 5.2% GDP growth. All right, that's kind of impressive. Then El Salvador, 2.3, Guatemala, 2.8, Honduras, 3.3. That's, those numbers are okay, right? And those are in capitalist countries that receive extensive foreign investment, not fettered by the state. Well, here's Cuba. In 06, 12% growth. 07, it dropped, but still 7%. 08, 4%. So the average during that period would probably be around that 7 mark. Way higher than any of those other capitalist countries receiving floods of foreign investment. Curious. So despite an economic model that's working, and despite workers who actually tend to enjoy their work, the assumption is that socialist models cannot really work effectively. That this is a sort of a typical quote, that the centralized planning model and level of state involvement stifles innovation, reduces competitiveness. It just doesn't work. Well, tell that to China, tell that to Vietnam, which has one of the fastest growing economies in all of Asia, which is a socialist market economy, and tell that to Cuba, given the numbers I just showed you. Well, you might say, okay, on the macro level, maybe it works, but on the micro level, it doesn't for people's actual individual living. Well, look at this. In terms of people's own personal economic security compared to the US and really most of the world, Cubans actually, contrary to popular opinion, and I'll walk you through this, actually have savings. They certainly have ownership, and they have zero debt, as opposed to a very different picture in the US and the rest of the world, with deficits, no ownership, and high debt for the vast majority of people. How does this work? All right. Well, a critical thing here is understanding that the picture is not just about wages, which is typically reported. The Cuban wage is $20 to $40. Okay, the wage. Well, for most societies in the world, particularly the global South, the wage is a completely inadequate measure of economic performance because it only refers to formal earnings. But all these folks who are in the informal economy or informal or independent sector, even in the United States, a growing number of people in as gig workers or outside of the formal economy, and folks who receive remittances are not included in that wage calculation. So in Cuba, the actual monthly income has been reported by a number of sources as around 150 a month, combination of remittances and self-employment. So way higher than the state wages. And when you look at the economic picture, you can't just look at the income side, you also have to look at the expense side and not make assumptions that there's only one model of expenses. What do I mean by that? So how do Cubans survive on $150 a month, which is $6 a day? And how does this compare to sort of an average worker? Let's take Brooklyn. Taking the median wage, I didn't even try to pick the lowest third, or just the median age of 4,400 a month, way higher, of course, than the Cuban wage or the Cuban income. And this would be considered like lower middle class in New York. Well, let's look at the budgets very quickly. So notice the numbers in purple are the Cuban budget. This assumes a single parent with one kid, just to keep it simple. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Zeros in some of the major typical cost centers for people's budgets. And very low amounts. And these numbers have been verified by my extensive talks with people there. So total expenses for a Cuban at the end of a month, on average, 123. Lower than their 150. But let's look at that Brooklyn lower middle class person making $54,000 a year, $4,400 a month. In their first two items, they've exceeded their monthly income. Now, you can debate about this. You can say, well, maybe their housing they probably wouldn't qualify $54,000 for much aid, maybe for some housing aid. So you could bring that down a little bit, bring down the daycare costs a little bit. Even if you bring those down by 1,000, you're still 1,000 in the hole at the end of the month. I think the point is clear that the expenses are so considerable, largely because we do not have a state which invests in key needs for people, that our expenses are so high that they actually exceed our incomes, leaving us in debt. Plus, this budget doesn't take into account quite a number of things on both sides, for both Cuba and the U.S. However, the most significant one probably here is one that applies only to the U.S., taxes. Because if you would take out the taxes for that person, their net income is going to be considerably lower. Whereas in Cuba, the only taxes that are paid are on businesses, no income, property, or sales tax. In sum, at just that meager income in a socialist system, which is providing subsidies and support for key things, Cubans can support an 18% saving rate with ownership and zero debt. Granted, there's little room for a lot of bling, for any bling really, for things, for materialism. And that's the key thing in terms of perception. Cubans have much less than you would see with Dominicans or folks here or other parts of the Caribbean. We walk around appearing as if we have much more. But when you actually look at ownership and debt, who's in a better situation? So the US, yes, with much more materialism, yet huge deficits, no ownership, little stability, and this is similar for most of the world. Entrepreneurship. A failed state certainly wouldn't be helping to enhance such levels of entrepreneurship. And here are some quick stories, some wonderful things. The woman in the middle lived in Germany, came back with some capital from Germany, and started this fabulous restaurant, which now has had to close only because of the oil embargo. Without access to the oil, she can't run, but she's had this fabulous restaurant otherwise, and she was employing people. She's so committed to Cuba that she came back, and there's a number of people like that. My friend, the creative with the hat, the woman in between us, she's a phenomenal designer who has won top fashion awards in Spain. Those are her shoes. She also makes these hats. And so she travels back and forth between Cuba and Spain. Bottom right, my optometrist, because I actually lost my glasses when I was in Cuba, but I was able to have them made by this wonderful mother-daughter pair, florist in my area who does very well, and the family on the bottom left lives below me where I stay, and I made them a $100 loan for them to be able to buy more inventory. And within 2 weeks, they paid me back because they sell all these items from the front of their home. Having seen how diligent they were in selling every day and trying to expand their business, I wanted to help. And so with just a small amount of capital that they often get from the remittances from their family members or a little bit of savings in Cuba, because of the state support, you can actually make a living off of such nominal income and nominal investment. And in terms of the impact of the situation today, yes, expenses are considerably higher. So you see the before that I just presented to you. Today, there's been about a 65% increase in costs, particularly transportation and food. Those are the main areas. But the business opportunities, if it wasn't for the oil embargo, these extreme situations, up until last year, these small businesses, informal, independent, were thriving, making just $10, $15 a day. You can make $240 a month and have still 17% savings.